The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 1882, and Grace Whitmore Vincent watched through her kitchen window as her neighbor Mrs. Patterson tore it open, read 3 lines, then walked directly to the home of Samuel Berkshire, the man Grace had been courting for nearly 8 months. 20 minutes later, Samuel himself appeared at her door with an expression that told her everything before he even opened his mouth. "Grace, we need to talk," he said, and she felt her stomach drop like a stone into a well. She had known this moment would come eventually. It always did. She invited him inside, where her daughter Lily sat on the floor playing with a cloth doll Grace had sewn from flour sacks. The little girl was 4 years old, with her mother's dark hair and gray eyes that seemed too knowing for such a young child. Lily looked up at Samuel with the same cautious hope Grace had seen in her own mirror lately, the hope that maybe this time would be different. "Perhaps we should speak outside," Samuel suggested, his gaze skittering away from Lily like a stone across water. Grace's jaw tightened, but she nodded. She asked Mrs. Chen from next door to watch Lily for a few minutes, then followed Samuel onto the porch of her small rental house on the edge of Rico, Colorado. The mining town sprawled beneath them in the valley, surrounded by mountains that were just beginning to show the gold and crimson of early autumn. The San Juan Mountains rose like sentinels in every direction, beautiful and isolating in equal measure. "You know I care about you," Samuel began, and Grace almost laughed at how predictable the words were. "But my mother has made it clear that she cannot accept this situation. A woman with a child already and no husband to show for it. The scandal." "The scandal," Grace repeated flatly. "Samuel, my husband, died. Thomas died in a mining accident 3 years ago. There is no scandal in widowhood." "But the child was born before you were married," Samuel said, and there it was, the real issue, the thing that always came between Grace and any chance at a new life. "Mother discovered the dates. You were only married 6 months before Lily was born." Grace felt the familiar burning in her chest, the mixture of shame and defiance that had become her constant companion. "We were married in a small ceremony as soon as Thomas found steady work. I will not apologize for loving him before a preacher said words over us, and I will not apologize for my daughter." "I am not asking you to apologize," Samuel said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I am simply saying that I cannot move forward with our courtship. My position in this town, my mother's reputation, it would not be appropriate to marry a woman with your history." The words hung in the mountain air between them, cold and final. Grace wrapped her arms around herself, though the September morning was not particularly chill. She had heard variations of this speech before. In Kansas, where Lily had been born, in New Mexico, where they had stopped for a year before Grace's meager savings ran out. Now here in Rico, where she had truly believed she might finally build a stable life for her daughter. "I see," she said quietly. "Then I suppose there is nothing more to discuss." Samuel had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Grace, you are a fine woman. You work hard at the boarding house, you are kind and intelligent, but surely you understand the position you have put yourself in. If you had not had a child out of wedlock—" "I had a child in wedlock," Grace interrupted, her voice sharp now. "That the wedding happened 6 months before instead of 9 makes no difference to me or to God. And if it makes a difference to you and your mother, then I am grateful to know it now rather than later." She turned and walked back into her house, closing the door firmly before Samuel could say anything else. Through the window, she watched him stand on her porch for a moment longer, his shoulders slumped, before he finally walked away. Mrs. Chen glanced at Grace with sympathy but said nothing as she returned to her own home next door. Lily looked up from her doll. "Is Mr. Samuel coming for dinner like he said?" Grace knelt beside her daughter and smoothed back her dark hair. "No, sweetheart, Mr. Samuel will not be coming any more." "Did I do something wrong?" Lily asked, and the question broke something in Grace's chest. "No, baby. You did nothing wrong. You are perfect, and do not let anyone ever tell you different." But as Grace prepared their simple dinner that evening, stirring beans over the stove while Lily chattered about a butterfly she had seen that morning, she felt the weight of their situation pressing down on her shoulders. Her job at the boarding house paid enough for rent and food, but barely. There was never anything extra, never any security. She had thought Samuel might be the answer, a stable man with a good job as a clerk in the mining office, someone who could give Lily a father and Grace a partnership. Now she was back where she always seemed to end up. Alone, struggling, and wondering how long she could keep going before something had to give. The next morning, Grace walked to the boarding house where she worked as a cook and occasional housekeeper. The establishment, run by a stern but fair woman named Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, catered primarily to miners and the occasional traveling businessman. Grace had been working there for 6 months, ever since she and Lily had arrived in Rico with almost nothing to their names. Mrs. Hayes met her at the kitchen door with unusual urgency in her expression. "Grace, I need to speak with you before you start." Grace's heart sank. Had news of Samuel's rejection already spread through town? Would she lose her job too? "There is a man here who needs a cook for a cattle drive," Mrs. Hayes said, and Grace blinked in surprise. "Not a full drive, just moving a herd from here up to a ranch outside of Silverton. 2 weeks of work, maybe 3. He is paying well, and I told him you might be interested." "I cannot leave Lily for 3 weeks," Grace said immediately. "He said his camp can accommodate families. Some of the men bring their wives to help with cooking and mending. It would be hard work, Grace, but the pay is 3 times what I can offer you for the same period. 3 times her normal wages." Grace did the mathematics quickly in her head. That would be enough to save a little, maybe buy Lily new shoes before winter. Maybe even put something away for emergencies. "Let me speak with him," Grace said. Mrs. Hayes led her to the dining room where a man sat with his back to them, eating breakfast. He stood when they entered, and Grace found herself looking up at one of the tallest men she had ever seen. He had to be at least 6 feet and 3 inches, with broad shoulders and the lean, weathered look of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. His hair was dark brown, sun-streaked in places, and his eyes were a startling blue against his tanned face. He looked to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most. "Madam," he said, removing his hat, "I am Xavier Hamilton. I am moving a herd of about 200 head up to my brother's ranch, and I need someone who can cook for 6 men for the next couple weeks." His voice was deep and slow, with an accent Grace could not quite place. Texas, maybe, or somewhere farther south. "Mrs. Hayes mentioned you might accommodate my daughter," Grace said, deciding to be direct. "She is 4 years old. I cannot leave her behind." Xavier Hamilton's expression did not change. "How old are you, if you do not mind my asking?" 23, Grace said, lifting her chin slightly. He nodded slowly. "Young to have a 4-year-old, but that is none of my business. Can you cook for hungry men? We will have beef, beans, coffee, whatever supplies you need. Can you do it over a campfire in all weather?" "I can cook anywhere," Grace said firmly. "I have been cooking since I was 10 years old. The work is hard, long days. Your daughter would need to stay out of the way of the cattle and horses. Can she do that? She is a good child, well behaved." Xavier studied her for a long moment, and Grace forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. She needed this job. 3 times her normal pay could mean the difference between barely surviving and actually having a small cushion against disaster. "All right," he said finally. We leave the day after tomorrow at dawn. Meet us at the stockyards on the north edge of town. Bring what you and your daughter need for 3 weeks on the trail. We will provide food supplies and camping equipment." "Thank you, Mr. Hamilton," Grace said, relief flooding through her. "Call me Xavier," he said. "We do not stand much on formality on the trail." He settled his hat back on his head, paid Mrs. Hayes for his breakfast, and left. Grace watched him walk away, his stride long and purposeful. "That is a good man," Mrs. Hayes said quietly. "I have known the Hamilton family for years." Xavier and his brother Zachary came up from Texas about 5 years ago and built that ranch outside Silverton from nothing. They are honest, hard-working men. Grace hoped Mrs. Hayes was right. She returned to the kitchen and threw herself into her work, trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Taking Lily into the wilderness for 3 weeks, living among strange men, cooking over campfires while watching over an active 4-year-old. But the money, she kept reminding herself, the money would make it worth the difficulty. That evening, she explained the situation to Lily as best she could. The little girl's eyes went wide with excitement at the idea of an adventure, sleeping under stars and seeing real cowboys. "Will there be horses, Mama?" Lily asked. "Many horses," Grace confirmed. "But you must promise me you will be very good and do exactly as I say. Horses and cows can be dangerous if you do not respect them." "I promise," Lily said solemnly, crossing her heart with one small hand. Over the next day, Grace packed what they would need. 2 dresses each, undergarments, warm coats because the mountains could turn cold even in early autumn. Her good knife for cooking, though Xavier had said supplies would be provided. A few of Lily's favorite small toys. Everything had to fit in one bag, because Grace knew from hard experience that you could not afford to be precious about possessions when your life was uncertain. She gave notice to the widow who owned the house she rented, explaining she would be gone for 3 weeks but would pay the rent for the time anyway. The woman agreed to let her store her few pieces of furniture in a shed out back. On the morning of departure, Grace woke before dawn. She dressed Lily in warm clothes and braided her own hair tightly to keep it out of her face. They walked through the dark streets of Rico toward the stockyards, their breath making clouds in the cold mountain air. Grace carried their bag over her shoulder and held Lily's hand firmly. The stockyards were already bustling with activity when they arrived. In the growing light, Grace could see the herd of cattle, mostly brown and white, milling in several large pens. 5 men worked among them, and Grace recognized Xavier Hamilton immediately, not just by his height, but by the way the other men seemed to defer to him. He saw her and Lily approaching and walked over to meet them. In the dawn light, she could see the details she had missed before. A scar along his jawline, calluses on his hands, eyes that seemed kind despite their intensity. "Morning," he said. "You travel light, that is good." "We have what we need," Grace replied. Xavier looked down at Lily, who was staring up at him with wide eyes. He crouched so he was closer to her level, which Grace appreciated. Too many men spoke over children's heads as if they were not really people. "What is your name?" he asked Lily gently. "Lily Vincent," she whispered, suddenly shy. "That is a pretty name. I am Xavier. Do you like horses, Lily?" She nodded enthusiastically. "Well, we have plenty of horses. Later, when we are on the trail and your mama says it is all right, maybe I can teach you how to feed one safely. Would you like that?" Lily's face lit up, and she looked at Grace hopefully. Grace felt something odd in her chest, watching this tall cowboy speak so naturally with her daughter. Samuel had never bothered to talk to Lily like she was a real person. "We will see," Grace said carefully. Xavier stood and gestured to a covered wagon. "That will be the chuck wagon. It has all the cooking supplies, plus a place where your daughter can rest during the day if she gets tired. I rigged up a canvas shade on one side where you can work. It is not fancy, but it should do the job." Grace examined the wagon. It was well maintained, with good wheels and a sturdy cover. Inside, she found sacks of flour and cornmeal, dried beans, coffee, salt pork, and even a few precious jars of preserved fruit. There was a Dutch oven, several cast iron pans, tin plates and cups, and a good supply of utensils. "This is very well stocked," she said, impressed. "I believe in feeding men properly," Xavier said. "Hungry cowboys are cranky cowboys, and cranky cowboys make mistakes. Mistakes with cattle can get people hurt." It was practical reasoning, but Grace appreciated it nonetheless. She had worked in enough kitchens to know that good food and full bellies made every job easier. Xavier introduced her to the other men. There was Buck, an older cowboy with silver hair and a weathered face, who Xavier said had been working cattle for 40 years. Danny and Cole were brothers in their early 20s, fresh-faced but competent-looking. Rafael was a Mexican vaquero in his 30s, quiet but with a friendly smile. And Sam was a former slave from Missouri, probably in his mid-40s, with steady hands and observant eyes. All of them tipped their hats politely to Grace and greeted Lily with friendly warmth. Grace relaxed slightly. These seemed like good men, the kind who would not cause trouble. "We are moving slow," Xavier explained as the men finished loading the last supplies. "The cattle need to graze and water regularly, and we are going through mountain passes that can be tricky. Figure 12 to 15 miles a day, maybe less in difficult terrain. Should take us about 2 weeks to reach the ranch, then a few days to get everything settled before I pay you and arrange transport back to Rico." Grace nodded. She climbed up onto the wagon seat, settling Lily beside her. Xavier would drive the wagon for the first stretch, he explained, until they got into the rhythm of the trail. Then he would show Grace how to manage the team of horses that pulled it, freeing him up to work with the cattle. As the sun rose fully over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of orange and pink, the men opened the stockyard gates and began moving the herd north. Grace watched them work, impressed by their coordination. Xavier rode a tall bay horse and seemed to be everywhere at once, his voice carrying clear instructions over the lowing of cattle and thunder of hooves. The wagon lurched into motion, and their journey began. The first day was chaos from Grace's perspective. She had never been this close to so many cattle before, and the noise and dust were overwhelming. Lily pressed against her side, excited but also a little frightened by the enormous animals surrounding them. Grace kept one arm around her daughter while holding onto the wagon seat with the other hand as they rolled slowly forward. They stopped around midday in a meadow where a creek provided water for the herd. Xavier showed Grace how to set up the portable cooking equipment, hanging pots from a metal tripod over a fire that Buck built with practiced efficiency. "Keep it simple for the noon meal," Xavier advised. "Coffee, beans if you have them left from breakfast, bread if you have time. The big meal is at night when the men have finished working." Grace nodded and set to work. She had brought sourdough starter with her, carefully wrapped and packed, and she made quick biscuits in the Dutch oven while coffee boiled in a large pot. The men ate standing up, washing down food with hot coffee before returning to the herd. Xavier ate last, after ensuring all the other men were fed. Grace noticed this pattern and filed it away. He was a leader who took care of his people before himself. "These are good biscuits," he said, and it was not flowery praise, just a simple statement of fact. Somehow that made it mean more. "Thank you," Grace replied. That afternoon, as the wagon rolled on, Lily dozed against Grace's side, worn out by the excitement and the steady rocking motion. Grace found her own eyes heavy, but she forced herself to stay alert. The trail was rough, with rocks and ruts that could tip a wagon if the driver was not careful. Xavier rode up alongside them periodically, checking that everything was all right. Once, he pointed out a pair of eagles circling overhead. Another time, he showed them where deer had left tracks crossing the trail. "You know this country well," Grace observed. "Been running cattle through these mountains for 5 years now," Xavier said. "You learn the land when your life depends on it." That evening, they made camp in a valley with good grass and water. Grace cooked in earnest for the first time, preparing a large pot of beef stew with vegetables, more biscuits, and strong coffee. The men ate like they had not seen food in a week, and Grace felt a quiet satisfaction in watching plates emptied and seeing contentment on tired faces. After dinner, the men took turns on watch, guarding the herd against predators and preventing the cattle from wandering. Xavier showed Grace and Lily where they would sleep, a tent he had set up near the wagon with bedrolls already laid out. "This is for you and your daughter," he said. "The men and I will sleep in the open unless weather turns bad." "You do not have to give up your tent," Grace protested. "Was not using it anyway," Xavier said with a slight smile. "I prefer sleeping under stars when I can." He left them to settle in, and Grace realized her hands were shaking slightly as she helped Lily change into her nightclothes. The kindness of the gesture, the simple thoughtfulness of it, had caught her off guard. She was so used to having to fight for every small consideration that she did not quite know how to respond when someone just gave freely. Lily fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the long day. Grace lay beside her, listening to the sounds of the night. Cattle lowing softly, horses moving in their picket line, the occasional murmur of men's voices as the watch changed. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. She should have been nervous, sleeping in the wilderness with 6 strange men. But somehow, she felt safer than she had in months. Maybe it was the fire burning nearby, or the solid presence of the wagon, or the knowledge that someone was always awake and watching. Or maybe, a small voice whispered in her mind, it was the quiet competence of the tall cowboy who had given her this job without judgment or questions about her past. The days developed a rhythm. Wake before dawn, build up the fire, make coffee and breakfast. Break camp, load the wagon, begin the slow migration north. Stop at midday for a quick meal and to let the herd rest. Continue through the afternoon. Make camp at evening, cook dinner, clean up, sleep, then do it all again. Grace's hands grew rough from the work, and her back ached from bending over campfires. But she found she did not mind. There was something satisfying about the simplicity of it, the clear tasks and visible results. And Lily was thriving, her cheeks growing pink from sun and fresh air, her legs strong from walking around camp under Grace's watchful eye. True to his word, Xavier taught Lily how to feed the horses safely, showing her how to hold her hand flat so the animal could take the apple or carrot without accidentally nipping fingers. He was patient with her endless questions, explaining how to read weather in the clouds, how to tell if a cow was sick, why the horses needed their hooves checked regularly. Grace watched these interactions with a confused mixture of feelings. Gratitude, certainly, that someone was being kind to her daughter, but also something warmer and more dangerous, a growing attraction to the man who moved through each day with quiet capability and unexpected gentleness. She tried to suppress the feeling. She had learned her lesson with Samuel. Men might seem accepting at first, but eventually her past always caught up with her. Xavier did not know the full truth about Lily's birth, about the rushed wedding and the scandal it had caused. Once he did, he would look at her differently, the way they all did eventually. But it was hard to maintain that cynical distance when Xavier came to the fire each evening with some small treasure for Lily. A perfectly smooth river stone, a hawk feather. Once, incredibly, a piece of quartz crystal that caught the firelight like captured stars. "You are spoiling her," Grace said one evening as Lily examined the crystal with wonder, holding it up to watch it sparkle. "Children should have pretty things," Xavier said simply. "Life is hard enough. A little beauty helps. Where did you learn to be so good with children?" Grace asked before she could stop herself. "Do you have brothers or sisters?" Xavier's expression shifted, something painful flickering across his face. "Had a sister. She died when I was 17. She was only 8. "I am sorry," Grace said quietly. "Fever took her down in Texas. One day she was running around playing, 3 days later she was gone." Xavier stared into the fire. "I think about her sometimes, wonder what kind of person she would have grown up to be. She loved horses and shiny rocks and stories." "Like Lily," Grace said softly. "Yeah, like Lily." Xavier looked up and met Grace's eyes, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. They had both lost people they loved. They both knew how fragile life could be. After that conversation, Grace found herself talking to Xavier more during the quiet moments of the day. She learned he and his brother Zachary had left Texas after their parents died within months of each other. Their mother from pneumonia and their father from a broken heart as much as anything else. The brothers had come north looking for new opportunities and found them in the rough country around Silverton, building a ranch from scratch through sheer determination and hard work. "Why cattle?" Grace asked one day as they navigated a particularly tricky section of trail, the wagon tilting at an angle that made her nervous. "You could have done anything." "No cattle," Xavier said, his hands steady on the reins. "Grew up around them. And there is good money in beef right now, with the mining camps needing to be fed. Plus, I like the work, like being outside, working with animals instead of underground in some dark mine shaft." Grace understood that. She had seen what the mines did to men in Rico, how they came out at the end of their shifts looking like ghosts, coughing up rock dust. They were about 10 days into the journey when the weather turned. Dark clouds built up over the mountains to the west, and the temperature dropped sharply. Xavier rode up to the wagon, his expression concerned. "Storm coming," he said. "A bad one, I think. We need to find shelter." He pushed the herd faster than usual, and Grace could see the tension in the way all the men worked. Even the cattle seemed nervous, moving with an agitated energy. They reached a canyon just as the first fat raindrops began to fall, and Xavier directed everyone toward an overhang of rock that provided some protection. The men worked frantically to secure the herd and set up a quick camp while Grace got Lily into the tent. Then the storm hit in full force, rain coming down in sheets so thick Grace could barely see the wagon just a few feet away. Thunder crashed overhead, echoing off the canyon walls, and lightning turned the world white for brief, terrifying moments. Lily clung to Grace, trying to be brave but clearly frightened. Grace held her daughter and sang softly, old songs her own mother had taught her, trying to provide comfort even as she worried about the tent holding against the wind and rain. Then the tent flap opened and Xavier was there, soaked to the skin. "Come on," he shouted over the storm. "This tent will not hold much longer. You need to get in the wagon." He helped them out into the deluge, and within seconds, Grace was as drenched as he was. Xavier lifted Lily easily and carried her to the wagon, then helped Grace climb up. Inside the covered wagon, it was dry and relatively warm, the canvas cover doing its job. "Stay here until the storm passes," Xavier said. "It should blow through in an hour or two." "What about you?" Grace asked. "Where will you shelter? The men and I will be fine under the rock overhang. We have dealt with worse." He looked at Lily, who was shivering despite being out of the rain. "There are extra blankets in that trunk. Get her warm." He started to leave, but Grace caught his arm. "Xavier, thank you." He looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. For a moment, something intense passed between them, something that made Grace's breath catch. Then Xavier nodded and slipped back out into the storm. Grace got Lily wrapped in dry blankets and held her close until she stopped shivering. The storm raged for nearly 3 hours, and by the time it finally blew itself out, twilight was falling. Grace ventured out to find the camp a muddy mess. But the men had managed to keep the fire going under the overhang, and everyone was accounted for, including all the cattle and horses. "No cooking tonight," Xavier said, looking exhausted. "Too wet, too late. We have jerky and hardtack. It will do." But Grace would not hear of it. "Give me 30 minutes," she said. "I can make something hot." She worked with fierce determination, using the driest wood from the protected pile, coaxing a proper fire to life. She made a thick soup from jerky, dried vegetables, and the last of the fresh bread, toasted over the flames. It was not fancy, but it was hot and filling, and she saw what it meant to the men to have warm food after the misery of the storm. Xavier ate his portion slowly, watching her across the fire. When she brought him a second serving without being asked, he looked up at her with something in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. "You are good at this," he said quietly. "Not just the cooking, the caring." Grace did not know what to say to that, so she just nodded and moved away, suddenly nervous. She put Lily to bed in the wagon since the tent had indeed collapsed during the storm, then stood outside looking up at the sky. The clouds had cleared, revealing a sky so full of stars it took her breath away. "Beautiful, is it not?" Xavier's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him standing a respectful distance away, also looking up. "I have never seen so many stars," Grace said. "In towns, there are too many lights, but out here you can see the whole universe," Xavier finished. "Makes you feel small but also part of something bigger." They stood in companionable silence for a while, and Grace felt something shifting inside her. She had been so focused on survival for so long, on just getting through each day, that she had forgotten how to simply be, how to stand under stars and feel wonder, how to accept kindness without waiting for the cost. "Xavier," she said slowly, "why did you hire me, Mrs. Hayes must have told you about my situation. A widow with a young child, the kind of woman most men avoid." Xavier was quiet for a long moment. "She told me you were a hard worker who needed a chance. That was enough for me. You did not worry about the propriety of it, having a woman in camp." "Grace, I have known prostitutes with more genuine honor than church deacons, and I have known men who quoted scripture while cheating their neighbors. I stopped judging people by what others say about them a long time ago. I judge by what I see with my own eyes." He turned to look at her directly. "And what I see is a good mother who works herself to exhaustion to care for her child. What I see is someone who makes hot soup for tired men after a storm when she could have just said it was too hard. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I was not widowed when Lily was born," she heard herself say. "My husband and I married 6 months before she arrived. People have judged me for that since the day she was born." "Were you and your husband in love?" Xavier asked. "Yes, very much." "Did he treat you and your daughter well?" "He was a good man. He died trying to earn enough money to give us a better life." Xavier nodded slowly. "Then the timing of a wedding does not matter one bit. You loved, you married, you had a child. The order is nobody's business but yours." Grace felt something break open inside her chest, a tight knot of shame and defensiveness she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. "Most men do not see it that way. Most men are fools," Xavier said bluntly. begging your pardon for the language." Despite herself, Grace laughed, a real laugh that felt rusty from disuse. Xavier smiled at the sound, and in that moment, standing under a sky full of stars with mud still on their boots from the storm, Grace felt something she had not felt since Thomas died. She felt hope. The remaining days of the journey passed both quickly and slowly. Quickly because Grace found herself enjoying the work, the rhythm of the days, the beauty of the mountains. Slowly because she found herself dreading the end, when she and Lily would return to Rico, and Xavier would go on with his life, and they would likely never see each other again. Lily, with the easy affection of a child, had adopted Xavier as a sort of honorary uncle. She chattered to him constantly when he was near, showing him interesting rocks she found, asking him to tell her stories about Texas and cowboys and horses. Xavier bore it all with patience and what seemed like genuine enjoyment, and Grace watched her daughter bloom under the attention of this kind man. On the 13th day, they came over a ridge and saw the ranch spread out in the valley below. It was more substantial than Grace had expected, with a large main house, a barn, several outbuildings, and a network of corrals and fences. The valley was green and lush, with a river running through it and mountains rising on all sides like protective walls. "Home," Xavier said simply, and there was satisfaction in his voice. They drove the herd down into the valley, and Grace could see people coming out of the buildings to greet them. A man who had to be Xavier's brother Zachary built along similar tall, broad lines. A woman with blonde hair in a practical braid who must be Zachary's wife. Several ranch hands. The process of getting the cattle settled took the rest of the day. Grace made a massive dinner in the ranch house kitchen. A real kitchen with a proper stove and abundant supplies, and she tried not to show how much she had missed having 4 solid walls and a roof overhead. Lily was shy around the new people at first but soon warmed up, especially to Zachary's wife Sarah, who spoke to her gently and showed her a litter of barn kittens. That evening, after dinner was cleared and Lily was asleep in a real bed in a guest room, Grace sat on the porch of the ranch house and watched the sun set behind the mountains. She was exhausted, every muscle aching, but it was a good exhaustion, the kind that came from honest work. Xavier found her there. He had cleaned up, shaved, changed into fresh clothes, and Grace was struck again by how handsome he was when you took the time to really look. "Zachary and Sarah say you and Lily are welcome to stay a few days before heading back to Rico," he said. "Rest up, let Lily play with the kittens, eat food someone else cooks for a change." "That is kind of them," Grace said, "and kind of you. You have been very generous, Xavier." "Just paying you what the work is worth," he said, but there was something else in his voice, something uncertain. Grace took a deep breath. She had to know. "What happens now? You said you would arrange transport back to Rico." Xavier sat down on the porch step near her chair. "I can do that. There is a supply wagon heading that direction in 4 days. You and Lily could ride with them." He paused. Or. Grace's heart was suddenly beating very fast. "Or you could consider staying," Xavier said, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We need a cook here at the ranch. Sarah does it now, but she is pregnant and the work is getting to be too much. Plus, we are planning to hire more hands next year, expand operations. We would need someone to cook for them." Grace felt dizzy. "Stay here. Permanently." There is a small cabin on the property about 100 yards from the main house. 2 rooms, a fireplace, good roof. It is yours if you want it. Pay would be $60 a month plus room and board. That is more than you make in Rico, I would wager. It was nearly double what she made in Rico. Grace's mind spun with the implications. Security, a home, space for Lily to run and play safely, but why? She asked. Why are you offering me this?" Now Xavier did look at her, and the intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. "Because I have gotten used to having you around. Because Lily is a good kid who deserves to grow up somewhere safe. Because you are the best cook I have ever had on the trail, and that includes the ornery old man we had last year who tried to knife someone for complaining about his beans." Grace laughed despite herself. "That is quite a recommendation. And because," Xavier continued, his voice dropping lower, "I would like the chance to know you better, without the pressure of a trail drive, without expectations, just as people, maybe as friends, maybe as more than that if you were willing." There it was, out in the open. Grace felt fear and hope warring in her chest. "Xavier, you know my history. You say it does not matter, but it might. You might wake up one day and realize you have tied yourself to a woman with a scandalous past." "Grace, I do not care about scandal, I care about character, and yours is gold." "You barely know me," Grace protested weakly. "I know you worked yourself half to death on that trail to feed 6 hungry men and never complained once. I know you comforted your daughter through a terrifying storm even though you were scared yourself. I know you are kind to animals, patient with questions, and you make biscuits that could make a grown man weep." Xavier smiled slightly. "I know enough." "And Lily?" Grace asked, because that was always the question. "You would be taking on a ready-made family, a child who is not yours." Xavier was quiet for a moment, and Grace felt her hope start to crumble. But then he spoke, and his words changed everything. "I always wanted to be a father anyway," he said simply. "I love children, always have. The fact that Lily comes as part of the package, that is not a drawback, Grace. That is a gift." Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks before she could stop them. "How are you real?" she whispered. Xavier reached over and very gently wiped the tears away with his thumb. "I am real. This is real, and if you want it, it is yours. No pressure, no expectations beyond the job itself. But I would be lying if I said I did not hope for more." Grace thought about Rico, about the boarding house, about the small rented room and the constant struggle. She thought about Samuel and his mother's disapproval, about all the other men who had looked at her with judgment when they learned about Lily's conception. Then she thought about the last 2 weeks, about cooking under stars, about Xavier teaching her daughter to feed horses, about feeling safe and valued and seen. "I would like to stay," she said. "I would like very much to stay." Xavier's smile was like sunrise, bright and warm and full of promise. Yeah, Grace confirmed, smiling through her tears. "But I am not making any promises beyond that, not yet." "Do not want you to," Xavier said. "Let us take our time, do it right." And because he was Xavier, he kept his word. Grace and Lily moved into the small cabin, and Grace took over the cooking duties for the ranch. It was hard work, feeding the ranch hands 3 meals a day plus packing food for men working far from the main house. But it was steady work with steady pay. And for the first time since Thomas died, Grace felt like she could breathe. Xavier courted her slowly and carefully. He stopped by the kitchen when he had time to talk, but never lingered so long that it would cause gossip among the hands. He brought Lily books from a box of his sister's old things he had saved. He fixed a sticky window in Grace's cabin without being asked. He was patient and respectful and made no demands. Slowly, Grace's walls came down. She found herself smiling more, laughing at Xavier's dry observations about ranch life. She started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she and Lily could truly belong. Lily, for her part, was thriving. She had gained weight, her cheeks round and rosy. She played with the barn cats and collected eggs from the chicken coop and followed Sarah around learning to churn butter. And she adored Xavier, racing to greet him whenever she saw him. secure in the knowledge that he would always stop what he was doing to talk to her. One evening in late October, nearly 6 weeks after Grace had arrived at the ranch, Xavier invited her and Lily to go riding with him to check on cattle in the upper pasture. Grace was nervous. She had not ridden a horse since she was a girl, but Xavier chose a gentle mare for her and showed her how to sit properly in the saddle. Lily rode in front of Xavier on his big bay, chattering happily the whole way. They rode up into the hills, where aspen trees had turned gold against the evergreen pines. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine needles and wood smoke from distant cabins. They stopped on a ridge overlooking the valley, and Xavier helped Lily down so she could run around safely in the meadow grass while they watched the cattle grazing below. "I love it here," Grace said, watching her daughter chase butterflies. "I did not realize how much I needed this. The space, the beauty, the peace." "It suits you," Xavier said. "Both of you, you look happier than when I first met you." "I am happier," Grace admitted. "Happier than I have been in years, maybe." Xavier dismounted and came to stand beside her horse, looking up at her with those blue eyes that always seemed to see right through her defenses. "Grace, I know I said we would take things slow, and I have meant that, but I need to tell you something." Grace's heart started to pound. "All right." "I am in love with you," Xavier said simply. "I have been falling in love with you since that day you made hot soup in the middle of a storm because you could not stand the idea of men going to bed cold and hungry. And I love Lily like she is my own. I find myself thinking about what it would be like if you and I were married, if the three of us were a real family." Grace could not breathe. "Xavier, I am not asking you to say yes right now," Xavier continued quickly. "I know you need time, you have been hurt, and you need to be sure. I understand that, but I want you to know where I stand. I want to marry you, Grace. I want to adopt Lily officially. I want to build a life with both of you, and when you are ready, if you are ever ready, I will be here waiting." Grace slid down from the horse, her legs shaky. She stood in front of this good, kind man who was offering her everything she had ever wanted, and felt terror and joy mixing together in her chest. "I am scared," she admitted. "I am scared of believing this is real and then having it taken away." "I know," Xavier said softly. "But Grace, nothing in life is guaranteed. Thomas loved you and he died. That was not your fault and it was not his. It was just life being cruel and random. But you cannot stop living because you are afraid of losing again." He was right. Grace knew he was right. She had been so focused on protecting herself and Lily from disappointment that she had almost missed the opportunity for real happiness. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to, but I do. I love you, Xavier Hamilton." Xavier's face lit up with joy. He reached for her hands, holding them gently. "Then marry me. Make me the happiest man in Colorado. Let me be the father Lily deserves and the husband you deserve." Grace thought about Samuel and his mother's disapproval. She thought about all the people who had judged her for having a child before the traditional wedding time frame. She thought about years of struggling alone, of being seen as damaged goods, of never being quite enough. Then she thought about Xavier teaching Lily to feed horses. About him giving up his tent during the storm. About him saying that loving Lily was a gift, not a burden. About him looking at her like she was precious and valuable and exactly what he wanted. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Xavier pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. Grace wrapped her arms around him and let herself believe, finally, that she was home. Lily came running over, breathless and smiling. "What are you doing?" Xavier crouched down to her level. "Lily, I asked your mama to marry me and she said yes. How do you feel about that?" Lily's eyes went wide. "Does that mean you will be my papa, if you want me to be?" Xavier said gently. "I would be honored to be your papa." Lily threw her arms around Xavier's neck. "I want that, I want a papa." Grace watched them, her daughter and the man she loved, and felt something broken inside her finally heal. She had spent so long believing that her past would always define her future, that she would always be paying for choices made in love and desperation. But here, in the mountains of Colorado, with autumn gold falling around them like blessings, she had found something better than redemption. She had found acceptance and love and a new beginning. They were married in early November in a simple ceremony at the ranch. The ranch hands attended, along with Zachary and Sarah and a few neighboring families. Grace wore a new dress Sarah had helped her make, deep blue wool that brought out her eyes. Lily wore a matching dress and carried wildflowers that Sarah had dried and preserved. Xavier wore his best suit and could not stop smiling. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the marriage, there was only supportive silence. No one mentioned scandals or questioned Grace's worthiness. They were just friends and neighbors gathering to celebrate two people who had found love in an unlikely place. That night, after Lily was asleep in her room and the celebration was over, Grace stood in the cabin that was now truly her home and thought about the strange path her life had taken. From Kansas to New Mexico to Rico to this remote valley, from widow to hired cook to wife, from alone and struggling to surrounded by love and support, Xavier came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "About how life surprises you," Grace said. "I thought I knew how my story would go. I thought I would always be alone, always struggling, always judged. And now I am married to a man who loves me and my daughter. Now I have a home and security and hope for the future. Now I believe in happy endings again." Xavier turned her in his arms and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. "This is just the beginning, Grace. We have a whole lifetime ahead of us." And he was right. Over the years that followed, Xavier and Grace built a life together that was richer and more joyful than Grace had ever imagined possible. Xavier formally adopted Lily when she was 5, and she became Lily Hamilton, taking his name with pride. She grew up strong and confident, secure in the knowledge that she was loved completely by both her parents. 2 years after the wedding, Grace gave birth to a son, Henry, named after Xavier's father. The birth was difficult, and for a few terrifying hours Xavier thought he might lose her. But Grace was strong, stronger than anyone gave her credit for, and she pulled through. When Xavier held his son for the first time, with Lily crowded close to see her new brother and Grace smiling tiredly from the bed, he felt a happiness so complete it almost hurt. 3 years after that, twin daughters arrived, Margaret and Rose, who kept the entire household in chaos with their matching mischief. Lily, now 10 years old, was an excellent big sister, helping Grace with the babies and teaching Henry how to find the best rocks and sticks for playing. The ranch prospered. Zachary and Xavier expanded their operations, hired more hands, built up one of the most successful cattle operations in the San Juan Mountains. Grace became known throughout the region for her cooking, and during busy seasons like calving and branding, neighboring ranchers would send their men to work at the Hamilton Ranch partly for the quality of the meals. But more than the success, more than the money or the growing herd or the respect they earned in the community, what mattered was the love they built. Xavier was a devoted father to all 4 children, making no distinction between Lily, who he had adopted, and the 3 who were his by blood. He taught them all to ride, to work cattle, to respect the land and animals. He read to them every night before bed without fail, even when he was exhausted from long days. And Grace, who had once believed herself too damaged for happiness, bloomed in the certainty of being loved. She smiled more, laughed often, and slowly let go of the defensive walls she had built up over years of judgment and rejection. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier and Grace stood on the same ridge where he had proposed, watching the valley below. Their children were with Sarah and Zachary for the evening, giving them rare time alone together. "You remember the first time we came up here?" Xavier asked, his arm around Grace's shoulders. "I remember thinking you were crazy for loving me," Grace said with a laugh. "I remember being terrified. And now," Grace leaned into her husband's warmth, "now I am grateful every single day, grateful for that job you offered me, grateful you saw past my fear and my history, grateful you loved my daughter as your own." "Our daughter," Xavier corrected gently. "She has always been ours." Below them, the ranch spread out in the evening light. Smoke rose from the chimneys, cattle grazed peacefully, horses moved in the corrals. It was a picture of prosperity and peace, built through hard work and sustained by love. "We did all right, did we not?" Xavier said softly. "We did more than all right," Grace replied. "We built something beautiful." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, Grace thought about that day in Rico when Samuel had rejected her, when she had felt like her life was over before it truly began. She thought about the telegram that changed everything, about a cowboy who needed a cook and was not afraid of a woman with a past. She had been rejected for having a child already. And Xavier had said he always wanted to be a father anyway. Those simple words had changed the course of her entire life, had given her back hope when she had none, had shown her that the right person would not see her circumstances as a burden but as a blessing. Now, 10 years later, with 4 children and a thriving ranch and a love that had only grown deeper with time, Grace finally understood what she had been too afraid to believe back then. She was not damaged goods. She was not too tainted by circumstance to deserve happiness. She was simply a woman who had loved and lost and loved again, who had fought for her child and her dignity, who had been brave enough to accept kindness when it was offered. And Xavier, the tall cowboy who had hired her without judgment and courted her with patience, had been brave enough to love a woman the world wanted to reject. Together, they had proven that family is not just about blood, that love is not constrained by convention, and that second chances are real if you are brave enough to reach for them. As they rode back down to the ranch where their children waited, Grace felt a peace she had never experienced before. This was home. This was family. This was the life she had never dared to dream might be hers. And it had all started with a job offer, a cattle drive, and a man who saw her not as a widow with a scandalous past, but simply as Grace, a woman worthy of love and respect and a future as bright as the Colorado sky. Years continued to pass at the ranch with the easy rhythm of seasons and the steady growth of children. Lily grew into a beautiful young woman, inheriting her mother's determination and her father's sense of justice. At 18, she surprised everyone by announcing her intention to become a teacher, wanting to educate children in the rural areas who had limited access to schooling. Xavier and Grace supported her dream, proud of the confident woman their daughter had become. Henry took to ranching like he was born to it, working alongside his father from the time he could sit a horse. By 15, he was handling cattle with the skill of men twice his age. But he also had his mother's gentle heart, often the one to find injured animals and nurse them back to health. The twins, Margaret and Rose, were a study in contrasts, despite looking identical. Margaret loved the outdoors and ranching life, while Rose preferred books and drawing, spending hours sketching the mountains and wildlife around them. Xavier and Grace encouraged both girls equally, believing children should follow their own paths through it all, Grace continued cooking for the ranch. Though as the years went by and the operation grew, she trained several younger women to help her. She became a mentor to young wives and mothers in the region, sharing not just recipes but wisdom about building a life in the hard but beautiful mountain country. Xavier's hair began to show silver at the temples, and lines deepened around his eyes from years of squinting into sun and wind. But his love for Grace never wavered. If anything, it grew stronger, deepened by years of partnership and shared challenges overcome together. They faced hard times, of course. A winter when they lost 50 head of cattle to cold and starvation. A spring when Henry broke his leg in a riding accident and they feared permanent damage. A summer when scarlet fever swept through the valley and they quarantined the ranch for weeks, terrified for their children. But they faced everything together, and their love proved stronger than any hardship. The ranch hands who worked for them stayed for years, unusual in an era when cowboys tended to drift from job to job. Something about the Hamilton ranch made men want to stay. Maybe it was the good food, or the fair wages, or the way Xavier treated his workers with respect. Maybe it was watching a marriage built on genuine partnership, and knowing that kind of love was possible. When Lily was 21, she brought home a young teacher named James Fletcher who was working at the school where she taught. He was a kind man with a gentle manner, and he treated Lily with the respect and admiration she deserved. Over Sunday dinner, Grace watched Xavier question the young man thoroughly but fairly, just as any father would. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Xavier said, "He reminds me of myself when I was younger, nervous but determined, clearly in love with our daughter." "You approve then?" Grace asked. "I do, but more importantly, Lily loves him. I can see it in her eyes." Xavier smiled. "Remember when she was 4 years old, playing with that cloth doll on your kitchen floor in Rico?" "I remember everything from those days," Grace said softly. "I knew the moment I met her that I would love that little girl," Xavier said. "And now she is grown and starting her own life." "How did that happen?" Grace went to her husband and wrapped her arms around him. "It happened because you loved us both without condition, because you gave her a stable home and a father who showed her what a good man looks like. Any happiness she finds, you helped make possible." Xavier held his wife close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling grateful for every day he had been given with this woman and the family they had built. Lily married James the following spring in a ceremony larger than Grace and Xavier's had been, with friends and neighbors coming from miles around. As Xavier walked his daughter down the aisle, Grace stood watching and remembered that day in Rico, when Samuel had told her no respectable man would marry a woman with her history. If Samuel could see Lily now, beautiful and confident and loved, surrounded by community and respect, would he regret his narrow judgment? Grace hoped so, but more than that, she was grateful his rejection had led her to Xavier. After Lily married and moved to the small town where she taught, Grace felt the change in the household. It was quieter without Lily's steady presence, and she understood for the first time what her own mother must have felt watching children grow and leave. But there was joy in it too. Watching Lily build her own life, seeing her daughter confident and secure in herself, knowing she had given Lily the foundation to thrive. All of it brought Grace a satisfaction deeper than she could have imagined in those desperate days when she had struggled alone. Henry showed no signs of wanting to leave the ranch. At 17, he told Xavier plainly that his future was in cattle and land, that he wanted to take over the ranch someday and continue building on what his father and uncle had started. Zachary's own sons were more interested in business ventures in Denver, so the agreement was made that Henry would eventually inherit the ranch in partnership with Xavier's continued involvement. The twins, at 13, were still finding their way. Margaret had declared her intention to run cattle like her brother, while Rose talked about going to art school in Denver or even San Francisco. Grace encouraged both dreams, remembering how limited her own choices had been at that age. On a summer evening when Grace was 39 and Xavier was 42, they sat on the porch of their cabin watching fireflies dance in the meadow. The children were all occupied elsewhere, Henry at a neighboring ranch helping with branding, the twins spending the night with friends in town. "We will be grandparents soon, probably," Xavier observed. "Lily and James have been married nearly 2 years. "Does that make you feel old?" Grace asked with a smile. "Makes me feel lucky," Xavier corrected. "When I think about the life I have been given, the family, the love, I cannot believe how fortunate I am." Grace took his hand, feeling the calluses from years of work, the strength that had never been used to hurt but only to protect and provide. "We have been fortunate in each other." "You know what I remember most clearly from that cattle drive?" Xavier asked. "It is not the scenery or the work. It is watching you make biscuits over a campfire while Lily played nearby, and thinking that I wanted to see that every day for the rest of my life. You working and humming to yourself, Lily happy and safe, and me close enough to be part of it." "You got your wish," Grace said, her throat tight with emotion. "I got so much more than a wish. I got a life beyond anything I imagined." They sat in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around them. Inside the cabin, Grace could see the life they had built reflected in every detail. Children's drawings pinned to walls, books on shelves chosen with care, a photograph of their wedding day in a simple frame. Outside, the ranch stretched away in every direction, prosperous and well-maintained, a testament to hard work and vision. But more than the physical things, Grace felt the intangible wealth they had accumulated. Trust built over years, love deepened by shared challenges, respect earned through patience and partnership. She had been so young when Thomas died, only 20, and those 3 years between his death and meeting Xavier had been the hardest of her life. She had felt like she was drowning, constantly struggling to keep her head above water. Xavier had not rescued her exactly. Grace had saved herself through sheer determination and will. But he had offered partnership when she needed it most, had seen value in her when society said she had none, had loved Lily when other men saw only inconvenience. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had married someone else?" Grace asked suddenly. "Someone without a complicated past." Xavier turned to look at her fully. "Grace Hamilton, are we really still having this conversation, after 15 years of marriage and 4 children?" Grace laughed. "I suppose it is silly." "It is not silly, but it is unnecessary." Xavier brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Every man has a chance at many different lives depending on the choices he makes. I chose you and Lily. That choice gave me the best possible version of my life. I have never regretted it, not for one single moment." "Not even when the twins put a frog in your boot," Xavier grinned. "Not even then." The following year brought both joy and sorrow. Lily gave birth to a son, making Grace and Xavier grandparents for the first time. Holding the tiny baby, seeing Lily glow with happiness as a new mother, Grace felt the circle of life continuing in the most beautiful way. But that winter, Zachary caught pneumonia. Despite everyone's best efforts, including bringing a doctor from as far away as Durango, he did not recover. Xavier sat with his brother through the final days, and Grace watched her husband grieve for the loss of his only sibling, the last connection to their childhood in Texas. After Zachary's death, Sarah decided to move to Denver to be near her own sons and their families. She sold her portion of the ranch to Xavier, with the understanding that Henry would eventually inherit it all. The transaction was fair and generous, reflecting years of family partnership and mutual respect. The loss of Zachary changed something in Xavier. He became more reflective, more aware of mortality and the passage of time. He spent more hours with Henry, teaching him not just the practical aspects of ranching but the philosophy behind their approach. He wrote long letters to Lily, sharing stories about his own childhood and his parents, wanting her to know the family history. And he became even more openly affectionate with Grace, as if Zachary's death had reminded him how precious and fragile life could be. He held her hand more often, told her he loved her multiple times a day, made sure she knew she was valued and cherished. Grace understood. She had lost Thomas so suddenly, so young. She knew that love was not guaranteed, that you had to hold it carefully and tend it faithfully because it could be taken away without warning. But she also knew that fear of loss should not prevent you from loving fully in the present. That was the lesson Xavier had taught her all those years ago on a cattle drive through the mountains. Love was worth the risk, family was worth the effort, and happiness was possible even after heartbreak if you were brave enough to reach for it. Margaret and Rose turned 18 and made their final decisions about the future. Margaret stayed on the ranch, working alongside Henry and learning the business with plans to buy her own herd eventually. Rose went to Denver to study art, and while Grace missed her terribly, she was proud of her daughter's courage in pursuing her passion. On Grace and Xavier's 20th wedding anniversary, their children conspired to give them a gift. Henry took over all ranch duties for a week. Lily came to stay and handle the household, and Margaret and Rose painted a sign that they hung over the main gate. Hamilton Ranch ESD. 1882, built on love. Xavier and Grace rode up to their ridge, the place that had become sacred to them over the years, and spent the day simply being together. They talked about everything and nothing, remembering the past and planning the future. They ate the lunch Lily had packed and watched clouds move over the mountains. They were older now, with gray in their hair and lines on their faces, but the connection between them was stronger than ever. 20 years, Grace said wonderingly. Some days it feels like 20 minutes, and other days it feels like we have been together forever. Both are true, Xavier said. Time is strange that way. Every day with you is new, but also, I cannot remember a time when you were not part of my life. We have built something good, have we not? Grace asked, looking out over the valley where their ranch spread out below them. Not just the land and the cattle, but the family, the love, the legacy. We have built something extraordinary, Xavier agreed, and you know the best part. We are not finished yet. We have years ahead of us still, grandchildren to spoil, children to support, a life to keep living fully. Grace leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling blessed beyond measure. She thought about the girl she had been at 18, pregnant and scared but in love. She thought about the widow she had been at 20, desperate and struggling with a young child. She thought about the woman of 23 who had stood in Mrs. Hayes' boarding house and agreed to cook for a cattle drive out of pure desperation. Each version of herself had been necessary to become the woman she was now. The struggles had taught her strength. The rejections had taught her resilience. The hard times had taught her to value the good times. And Xavier, with his steady love and unwavering support, had taught her that she was worthy of happiness. As the sun began to set, they rode back down to the ranch where their family waited. There would be a celebratory dinner, probably speeches and toasts, certainly laughter and joy. Their life was full and rich, and exactly what Grace had dreamed of during those dark days when she thought happiness was impossible. The years continued their steady march. Lily had 2 more children, daughters who Grace and Xavier doted on shamelessly. Henry married a sensible woman named Catherine who loved ranching as much as he did, and they gave the ranch new energy and ideas. Margaret bought her own herd and proved she had the Hamilton talent for cattle. Rose's paintings began to sell in galleries in Denver and San Francisco, and she sent money home to her parents, which they promptly invested in savings for her future. Grace and Xavier aged gracefully into their 50s, then 60s. Their hair went fully silver, their bodies moved a bit slower, but their love remained vibrant and alive. They still rode up to their ridge on anniversaries. They still held hands on the porch in the evenings. They still looked at each other with the same warmth and affection that had sparked on a cattle drive decades earlier. When Grace was 65, she fell ill with a fever that scared everyone. Xavier sat by her bedside for days, holding her hand and telling her stories about their life together, reminding her of all the reasons she needed to fight and recover. And Grace, as strong in her 60s as she had been in her 20s, pulled through once again. "You are not getting rid of me that easily," she told Xavier when the fever finally broke. "We still have grandchildren to raise and a ranch to oversee." "Thank God," Xavier said, and there were tears in his eyes. "I cannot imagine this life without you, Grace. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." On their 30th anniversary, the family threw a massive celebration. Lily and her family came from the town where she taught. Rose came from Denver with her new husband, a fellow artist who Xavier approved of after thorough questioning. Margaret was there with her partner who ran cattle on the adjoining property. Henry and Catherine hosted the event at the ranch with their 3 children running around underfoot. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled the house with noise and laughter. Friends and neighbors came to honor a marriage that had become legendary in the region, a testament to love that endured and grew stronger through the years. Xavier stood to make a toast, and the room fell silent. He looked at Grace, sitting beside him with silver hair and smile lines around her eyes, still beautiful after all these years. "30 years ago, I hired a woman to cook for a cattle drive," he began. "I thought I was just filling a position, solving a practical problem. I had no idea I was meeting my future wife, the mother of my children, the partner who would make every day better just by being in it." He paused, looking around at the assembled crowd. "Grace came to me with a past that society said made her unworthy. She had a child, she was widowed young, she had made choices that people judged. But I saw something different. I saw a woman of strength and character, a mother who would do anything for her child, a person of integrity and heart." Xavier turned back to Grace, taking her hand. "You gave me Lily, who I love as completely as any child of my blood. You gave me Henry, Margaret, and Rose. You gave me a home filled with love and laughter. You gave me a partnership that has made me a better man. Everything good in my life traces back to that day when you agreed to cook for my cattle drive." There were tears in many eyes now, including Grace's. "I said then that I always wanted to be a father anyway," Xavier continued. "What I did not say, what I did not even know yet, was that I wanted to be your husband. I wanted to be part of your family. I wanted to build a life that honored the love you had lost while creating something new and beautiful. And Grace, my love, we did it. We built something extraordinary." He raised his glass. "To 30 years of marriage, to the woman who took a chance on a cowboy, to the life we built together, to Grace, my wife, my love, my everything." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Grace stood and kissed her husband, not caring who was watching, not caring about propriety or convention. After 30 years, she knew what mattered. Love mattered. Family mattered. The life you built with your choices and your courage mattered. Later that night, after the guests had left and the grandchildren were tucked into beds throughout the house, Grace and Xavier stood on their porch one more time. The night was clear, the stars brilliant overhead, the mountains standing eternal in every direction. "Do you remember the first time we stood under stars together?" Grace asked. "After the storm on the trail." "I remember," Xavier said. "I remember thinking that I wanted to stand with you like that for the rest of my life." "You got your wish again," Grace said with a smile. "I keep getting my wishes when it comes to you." They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the ranch at night, feeling the presence of family sleeping safely nearby, knowing they had built something that would outlast them both. Grace thought about the telegram that had arrived so many years ago, the one that brought Samuel to her door with rejection. At the time, it had felt like the end of hope, but it had actually been the beginning of everything. If Samuel had not rejected her, she would never have taken the job with Xavier. She would never have gone on that cattle drive, never have cooked over campfires while Lily played nearby, never have stood under stars and felt her heart opening to possibility again. Rejection had led to acceptance. Loss had led to love, struggle had led to strength, and a chance job cooking for Cowboys had led to a lifetime of happiness. "Thank you," Grace said softly. "For what?" Xavier asked. "For seeing me, for loving Lily, for giving us a home and a family and a life beyond anything I imagined possible. For saying you always wanted to be a father anyway." Xavier pulled her close. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, for being brave enough to try again after loss, for bringing Lily into my life, for giving me children and a partnership and 30 years of happiness, for being exactly who you are." As they finally went inside to their own bed in the cabin they had shared for 3 decades, Grace felt complete. Her life had not been easy, but it had been full. She had loved and lost and loved again. She had raised children who knew they were valued. She had built a home that welcomed anyone who needed it. She had proven that a woman with a so-called scandalous past could create a beautiful future. And she had done it all alongside a man who had seen her worth when others saw only judgment. A cowboy who had said he always wanted to be a father anyway and meant it with his whole heart. A husband who had loved her completely for 30 years and counting. The story that had begun with rejection in a small Colorado mining town had become a love story for the ages, proof that second chances are real, that family is what you make it, and that the right person will not see your past as a burden, but as part of what makes you beautifully, perfectly you. In the mountains of Colorado, in a valley where cattle grazed and children grew and love flourished, Grace and Xavier Hamilton had built a legacy, not just of land and livestock, but of love that endured, of family that supported, of hope that persisted even in the darkest times. And every day, for the rest of their long lives together, they were grateful for a cattle drive, a campfire, a moment of honesty under stars, and the courage to believe that happiness was possible even after heartbreak. They grew old together on that ranch, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, living proof that love built on respect and acceptance and genuine partnership can weather any storm. And when people asked them the secret to their long, happy marriage, Xavier always gave the same answer. "I found a woman of strength and character, and I was smart enough to recognize her worth when others could not. And Grace was brave enough to believe in love again." Everything else just followed from that. Grace would always add, and he meant it when he said he wanted to be a father. "He loved my daughter as his own from the very first day. That told me everything I needed to know about his character." Their love story became the stuff of family legend, passed down through generations. The tale of how rejection led to the greatest love, how a cattle drive changed 2 lives forever, how a cowboy and a widow built an empire on faith and hard work and unwavering devotion to each other. And in the end, that is what mattered most. Not the scandal that never was, not the judgments of narrow minds, not the hardships they faced along the way. What mattered was the love they built, the family they created, and the legacy they left behind. Grace Whitmore Vincent Hamilton and Xavier Hamilton lived long, full lives surrounded by love. And when they finally passed, years later, within months of each other, they left behind a family that stretched across generations, all of them knowing they were descended from a love story that proved second chances are real and that the right person will love all of you, including your past, your present, and your future. The ranch still stands today, run by descendants who carry on the Hamilton tradition of fair dealing and hard work. And above the gate, the sign still reads, Hamilton Ranch EST. 1882 built on love, because in the end, that is exactly what Xavier and Grace did. They built a life, a family, and a legacy on love that refused to be constrained by convention or limited by judgment. They proved that family is not just about blood, that fatherhood is about choice and commitment, and that the deepest love often comes when you are brave enough to see past surface judgments to the true worth of another person. She was rejected for having a child already. The cowboy said he always wanted to be a father anyway. And from those simple truths, an extraordinary love story unfolded, one that lasted a lifetime and echoed through generations, forever proving that the best love stories are not the easy ones, but the ones where two people choose each other completely, past and present and future, building something beautiful from honest hearts and courageous faith in each other.